so I'm a little perplexed here because that song just gets me crying every time. Gosh, I'm so grateful to be here.
So grateful.
I'm so grateful to be here to have an opportunity to share my journey. And I know so many of you from so many different places. You know, some of you know me from back in the day at Cape Counseling, a rather restrictive environment for me. I don't do well in boxes. And I always kind of had to hide my and I had to hide my own story. And I can't tell you how many times, like, I'd be up teaching a class, a mood management class. Yeah, what? I'm not. Yeah, I do techie stuff. Okay, is that good? No. Okay.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay. So, now you can hear me? All right, we'll just do like that. How's that? That's working? So, anyway. So back in the day when I was teaching the mood management classes, I can't tell you how many times, you know, I have people that are coming out of the hospital with depression and anxiety and bipolar illness and, you know, like, yeah, that sounds all well and good, Sandy, but, you know, you don't get me. You've never dealt with what I've dealt with. Really? Really? Like, what makes you so sure of that? How do you know that just because you look at me today that I haven't walked that path? And it was so hard for me in that context to always have to be the clinician, because clinicians, you know, it's kind of, there's the clinician, and then there's the patient. And there's this sort of artificial barrier. And that never works for me. So I'm grateful that I can remove the barrier and just be myself now, and I thank you. So the truth is, you know, there's a verse in the Bible that says to work out our own salvation in fear and trembling. And I enter into sharing my story with a little bit of fear and trepidation, because the truth is that as people hear my story, you know, some people might want to discredit me. Like, really, you're a therapist and this is where you've been and what you've done? But my hope is that within a Christian context, I think there is a place for sharing testimony and giving witness to what God has brought us through. And when I'm giving testimony, I'm not giving testimony to, like, any clinical skill to fix people. I'm giving testimony to God's grace and God's healing that's available to all of us who choose to surrender. So that's where we're going. And I just gotta say, when I get going about my story, I get a little impassioned. And those of you who know me, I tend to go off on tangents. And sometimes my words can get a little colorful. Sometimes my potty mouth comes out when I get impassioned. So I'm going to ask for a little interaction here. If I start going off on a tangent and I'm going a little too far, I'm going to ask for this. Reel it in. And that's going to tell me, reel it in, babe. Come on, reel it in. And I'll get it, okay? And if I, like, do a blooper, if, like, a colorful word comes out of your mouth, can you just be my censor and just say, and that'll get me back on track, okay? So, that's my request. What I want to do tonight is tell my story, share what I've learned, the insights that I've learned from my own, you know, from my own experience, from my own journey, also from some book learning, but really street learning more than anything. And more importantly, and where my journey really started growing is when I started choosing to learn from God instead of the counsel of men.
Amen.
That's where the real healing began. And it's kind of funny, I mean, I'm a minister's daughter. I don't know if you guys knew that. I'm kind of stubborn. I don't like to be told what to do. So it kind of took me a long way to come back to this root. And for real, I love the Lord, I love God, and there are times where certain phrases, certain little religious catchphrases, like too much Jesus in my face, is like, ooh, get that out of here. I don't like people forcing things down my throat, and for me, that sent me on a journey away from the church. And so I know where I stand today, but I love to just embrace people exactly where they're at.
Amen.
So getting to my story. God, I don't know where to begin. So first of all, my family, we have a very colorful genetic makeup. On my father's side of the family, we have significant depression, suicide, bipolar illness, schizophrenia. On my mom's side of the family, it's kind of the lighter dose, garden variety of anxiety and depression, codependency that we just never really talk about, but it's there. But the bottom line is, as a pastor's family, you know, we're supposed to sort of be the pillars of the community, so we always got to look good. And we don't talk about what's really going on. And that was the most damaging thing for me. And I know that, you know, I love my parents, I love my family, and I know none of that was intentional, but people just do what they learned, you know. So I grew up in that context, and my understanding now is that when you have a predisposition towards depression, anxiety, addiction, it's kind of like it's there and it lays dormant, and you may or may not enter into that illness, but if the situations are right and something kind of triggers that cycle and sets that off in motion, then it kind of like takes on a life of its own. So for me, before I went to college, I traveled with a group called Up With People. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. It's a little singing and dancing group, and we traveled all around, and it was just a crazy schedule. I mean, for a year, I lived from a suitcase. Every 2 days, we were in a new town. Every 2 days, we were, you know, putting up a new set, doing a new show, dancing, scheduled from 7 in the morning till 11 o'clock at night. Maybe one day off a month. Like, you're not supposed to live that way. So I think I was like so jacked up that I was like basically living in mania. And then I went to, not even knowing it, and I went to college and had a wonderful first year. I mean, just Little Miss everything, involved in everything. Little Miss Social Butterfly, student government, lacrosse, dance theater, everything. You know, loved it. And then my sophomore year, I got really sick. I had some issues with my thyroid. Basically, my thyroid just stopped working. I got pneumonia. My immune system got low, and everything just crashed. And so I went from up here to like, boom! I mean, crash and burn. And I wound up having to leave school. And like I said, when you have the predisposition towards an illness, if the situations are right to trigger that cycle, that set off that cycle for me. So now I'm in the swing. Now I'm in the bipolar swing. Mania, depression. Mania, depression. So the end of my sophomore year, I landed myself in a psych hospital. Manic psychosis. It's not pretty. It's scary to share this. And it's painful to look back on it. There's elements of what I went through. I'm sorry. So I was just sharing this with someone that sometimes when I'm in my dark moments, the way that I get through things is I envision when I die and I sit down with Jesus and we're like going over my life, I'm just going to get out popcorn and like watch the bloopers of my life. And it's just going to be so funny. So I can look back on some of those things when I was in the hospital and like, wow. I can look back on some of it with humor, but some of it is just so deeply painful that it truly scarred me. I mean, really for life. There are emotional scars that, you know, it's like a physical wound. It's not raw, it doesn't hurt anymore, but the scar's there. And I'm always going to know it's there. And so for me, I guess I just want to share one thing that really stands out for me. It's funny, a friend of mine from high school, we were both in Friends Hospital. So we were friends. And anybody been to Friends? Anybody know Friends?
No.
So I figured some people might. And we were both in Friends Hospital. However, she was 18 and I was 19. And so at 18, they still considered her within the adolescent, like on the cusp of adolescence. So she was on the adolescent ward. They had movie night, they had bowling, they had ping pong, all kinds of fun. Socialization. Me, I'm 19. They didn't know what to do with me. I'm too old to be with the adolescents, but too young to be with the adults, and they didn't want to have me with the adults, interacting with the adults. So they put me on an isolation unit for 3 months. And I lived in, I would say the whole hall was about like this. And there were 2 rooms, my room and a little old lady who was in the room next to me, who shrieked, just shrieked at the top of her lungs 24 hours a day. And then there was a little like TV lounge where you could just sit and numb out and watch TV. And maybe every 6 hours someone would come check on you. And I'm like delirious, and I don't even know how I landed there. How did I get here? And I got to tell you, in spite of that all, there's some kind of visionary moments that I had in the midst of that too, that of course I would never share with the doctors because they would just keep me there forever. But I remember that lady that would just shriek. And even in my delirium, I had enough heart and common sense to know, dear God, someone comfort this woman. So I got out of my room and I went over and I just held her hand and I was just kind of stroking her hair. Well, in come the Nazi nurses. Don't you know? You're not supposed to be interacting with other patients. Grab me away, shoot me up with Haldol, lock me in restraints, and leave me to sit in a restraint chair for quite a long time. I look back on that now and it pisses me off because you know what? Truth be told, it's negligence on the part of the healthcare staff to leave like a psychotic woman unattended for 6 hours, but I'm going to be punished by getting shot up with Haldol. I don't get it. However, I didn't have a whole lot of power to do anything about that. So, I did eventually get out after I learned, don't fight with the doctors, don't try to get into intellectual debates, don't try to escape, it's not going to work, they'll just say that you're non-compliant with treatment, just do what they tell you and get out. So that's what I did. And I got out, but throughout my 20s, what do you do? So now I'm supposed to go back to college and function like everybody else? Really? I'm walking around with a scarlet letter, like, I just felt like I was defective, like no one understands what it feels like to be me. And I don't even know how to explain it. I look back on it now, and I realize that basically, the majority of my 20s, I was dealing with PTSD, post-traumatic stress, from what I experienced in that hospital. I just didn't know how to make sense of it. And I just spiraled in and out of anxiety. I lived in panic, just panic. I would break into a sweat having to go out in a social situation because I was so feared up in anxiety of like, what are other people thinking? They can tell them different, they can tell them weird, I know they can tell them different. Just terrified. And so most of the time what I would do is I would let that anxiety overcome. Instead of me managing the anxiety, I let the anxiety manage me. And so I would just avoid and retreat any situations that might create that anxiety. I'm not going to go there because I'm really anxious. I know I'm not going to fit in. I know I'm going to feel weird. So I just wouldn't go. Well, what do you think happens over time when you just sit in your house all the time and isolate? You kind of start to get depressed, right? And it just becomes this vicious cycle. And so I spent really all of my 20s cycling in and out of that. And it cracks me up, like somehow through the midst of that, I graduated college. I don't even know. I didn't really get into the drinking scene. I drank, but that wasn't my thing. However, I did hook up with all the wrong men, thinking that somehow that would make things better, and it didn't really work for me. So that was my 20s and 30s. And I'd say by my mid-20s,